Okay, I'm going to do what I can to keep this pretty brief. I'm going to just say a few things you need to know about Thomas Aquinas, and particularly what you need to know about your reading assignment. So let's jump in. He was born around 1224 in the county of Aquino. This is where he gets his name. This is somewhere between Rome and Naples. Starting in 1231, he was educated at nearby Monte Cassino, the monastery. Now, hopefully that rings a little bit of a bell. That is, of course, the monastery that was originally founded by Benedict of Nursia. And it was there at Monte Cassino that Thomas began his education in Latin, in the church fathers, in scripture, and so on. Now, from 1239 to 1244, he studied at the University of Naples, which interestingly was the very first university in Europe founded entirely independently of church authority. So, in that sense, a secular institution. And that is where Thomas studied the arts curriculum, and that is where he got his first big dose of Aristotle, which would really sort of change his life and change his whole approach to theology. Towards the end of his time in Naples, he made another life-changing sort of decision. He decided to become a Dominican friar. He was very attracted to the Dominican ideal of contemplation on the one hand, but teaching and preaching on the other. So he becomes a Dominican to the great chagrin of his family, whose family was quite aristocratic and had high hopes for him. He's then going to be sent, starting in 1245, to Paris. I mentioned the University of Paris in the previous lecture. Paris was, and would remain for a very long time, the premier place in Western Europe to study theology. And not only does he go to the premier place, but Thomas studies theology under the premier theology master of the day, a guy known, at least now, as Albert the Great. Albert was someone who had a truly impressive and magisterial command of the works of Aristotle. So this time with Albert only further cements in Aquinas' mind that the theologian needs to be as well grounded in the works of Aristotle as possible. Now, in 1248, so about 3 years after he's arrived in Paris, the Dominican order starts a new school for Dominicans in Cologne, in modern-day Germany. Albert was put in charge of that school, and he took Thomas along with him as his prized protege. Now, it's during this time, this time in Cologne, from about 1248 to 1252, I'm not going to be quizzing you about dates, okay? So don't worry about that. But this is the time that Thomas actually begins writing. This is when his writing career begins. He writes a few theological works. He also starts writing biblical commentaries at this time, which is no big surprise because, again, as I mentioned in the other video, it was part of the requisite training of any university theologian to lecture on the books of the Bible. And if you're able to do that, you should also be able, at least at some point, to write commentaries on them as well. It's also during this time that Thomas was ordained as a priest, which was pretty typical for friars. In 1252, he returns to Paris. He lectured as a bachelor on scripture and also on Peter Lombard's The Cynicism. So again, Thomas is receiving the kind of education, university education, that I described in my previous lecture. And just to give you some sense of how already at this point early in his career, how Aristotle was so critical for Thomas, in Thomas's commentary on the sentences, so this is a theological work, in his commentary on the sentences, he cites Aristotle 2,000 times, give or take. So that gives you a pretty good flavor of things. Well, in 1256, he reaches the pinnacle of his education, of his university training. He becomes a master of theology and was appointed to one of the main theology chairs at the University of Paris. So he is really riding high in terms of his career. But he is a Dominican. This means that he doesn't get to decide where he goes or stays or any of that. He is, he has to follow the bidding of his Dominican superiors. And in 1259, he is ordered to leave Paris and to spend some time in Italy, various places in Italy. And this is basically a decade of his life, from 1259 to 1268, moving around to various locations in Italy. In terms of writing during this period, during this decade, again, 1259 and 1268, he writes probably his second most famous work, which is the Summa Contra Gentiles. Gentiles, Gentiles, spelled exactly like Gentiles. Literally, it means a summa, theological summation against the nations, Gentiles, meaning unbelievers, basically. And it's very interesting work. It's in 4 books. And the first 3 books are devoted to Christian beliefs that can actually be borne out by reason alone. So these are things that Christians believe, but things that can also be demonstrated to be totally consistent with human reason. And then you get to the 4th book, which is devoted to Christian beliefs that are rational, to be sure, but that are not based on reason alone, but on revelation as well. And one of the things that's interesting about this work is its purpose. I mean, there's been some speculation as to exactly why Thomas wrote this kind of work, but I think one of the leading theories is that it was meant to be a kind of handbook for missionaries, specifically missionaries who were going to places like southern Spain and North Africa and evangelizing or trying to evangelize Muslims. So, he belongs to a missionary order. I mean, friars are very much missionary by nature. And so, yes, he's writing these works of theology, but he's writing them with pastoral and sort of missiological intentions. This is also the decade where he begins writing his most famous work, the Summa Theologiae, the summation of theology. More on that in just a moment. Well, in 1268, he returns to Paris and is there for about 4 years. He begins to write commentaries on the works of Aristotle, while at the same time lecturing on the Gospel of John and continuing to work on the Summa Theologiae. So I mentioned this just to kind of give you some insight into the mentality of a 13th century scholastic theologian like Aquinas, in which it makes perfect sense to be writing a book of theology, lecturing on the Gospel of John, and commenting on the works of Aristotle. So 3 things that today in the modern academy are almost always, dare I say, quarantined from one another. So biblical studies, theology, philosophy. For Thomas, these all go very much together. All right, well, he is recalled to Naples in the year 1272, and that is where he will spend the rest of his life. He was called there because he was asked by one of his Dominican superiors to start a Dominican school there in the city. He continued to write, although he did not ever quite complete the Summa Theologiae. One of the things that's most fascinating about Thomas Aquinas is, here you've got a guy who in many ways was the consummate scholastic theologian. And when you read the works of Thomas, even if you really appreciate or even love them, uh, they are very much works of academic theology. They have a very, very different flavor than the works of, say, Bernard of Clairvaux, or certainly of some of the mystics that we're going to be reading in the weeks to come. And yet, Thomas Aquinas has a mystical experience, December 6th, 1273, that changes his life forever. He was receiving the Eucharist, and something happens. Something happens that changes him for good. He reflected on this experience later, and let me quote from Thomas himself: "I cannot do any more. Everything I have written seems to me straw in comparison with what I have seen." So this mystical experience is so overwhelming to him that he cannot even write anymore. He is done. He dies the next year. He would have been 50 at the oldest. He may well have died before reaching his 50th birthday. So everything that he wrote in just a couple of decades, which is truly amazing, because he wrote a lot. A modern edition of his works runs to about 34 volumes. Not only did he write a lot in quantity, but he wrote in basically every genre of sort of medieval theology that you could write in, apart from mystical theology. As I mentioned, he wrote biblical commentaries. I also mentioned that he wrote philosophical commentaries, like commentaries on Aristotle. He wrote multiple summae, or sort of theological handbooks. He wrote what were known as quodlibeta. That's Quodlibeta. These are sort of like occasional writings on very specific theological topics. So not works in which he's trying to integrate a bunch of different theological topics together, but he's just treating, one very specific kind of issue. And I should mention that even though he didn't write anything that could really be qualified as mystical, he did write liturgical texts. He wrote hymns and prayers and things like that. So he is by no means some sort of one-dimensional kind of theologian. Now, our reading for next week is from the Summa Theologiae, from his most famous work, a work that in some ways takes a while to catch on. It takes a couple of centuries to catch on. So, I mentioned in the previous lecture that Peter Lombard's Sentences, that was the primary theology scholastic textbook for centuries. It's not until the time of the Reformation, or a little bit later, that Thomas Aquinas really supplants Peter Lombard, and that the Summa Theologiae in particular supplants the four books of the Sentences as the standard theological textbook for aspiring Roman Catholic theologians. This is a work of what the medievals would call sacred doctrine, doctrine whose principal goal or intention is to transmit knowledge of God. So, just because we can accurately describe this work as a work of academic theology, that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in the Middle Ages as it means now. We might mean that now, like, oh, that's academic theology. It's not really meant to transform people's spiritual lives. Well, that's certainly not true of Thomas or the way he thought about theology. In the prologue, he actually says that this is just a little work that I'm writing for beginners in theology. Now, you're going to read this and you're going to think, oh my God, like if someone was a true beginner in theology, they would not be able to make heads or tails of this. It's clearly not for absolute beginners. But I do think he sincerely meant for the work to be a kind of comprehensive overview, a kind of almost what we might call encyclopedia of theology. And I have to say, this is a work, by the way, which is totally available, free and in English translation on the web. And, anytime you're dealing with like a particular theological question, odds are very good that A, Thomas Aquinas has said something about it in the Summa, and B, that what he said is at least interesting. So it's always kind of a nice starting point. If you always wondered, like, oh, why this, why that, read what Thomas has to say, and you can go from there. All right. A couple of things you need to understand about the Summa in order even just to sort of access it at all. The first thing is that it is in 3 major parts. Now, it was the Summa Contra Gentiles that was in 4 parts. The Summa Theologiae is in 3 parts. The first part is sort of about God in God's self. The second part is subdivided into 2 parts. So the first part of the second part, well, let me say this. The second part in general is about sort of the movement of the rational creature toward God. How do we move back toward God? We are ontologically inferior to God. We have been estranged from God by sin. How do we begin the movement back toward God? Or what does that movement look like? Who initiates that? I mean, that's going to be really one of the questions of our reading. So the first part of the second part is specifically sort of about human actions, passions of the soul, virtue and vice, law, things like that. And then there is a section towards the end on grace, and that's where our reading comes from. The second part of the second part are specifically about what are known as the theological virtues, so faith, hope, and love, and also the cardinal virtues like justice and temperance and things like that. And then finally, the third part, which is the unfinished part, is about the God-man. It's about Jesus Christ and how Jesus Christ leads us back to God. All right, so 3 main parts, and the second part subdivided into 2. Each part is further subdivided into a series of questions. There are over 600 questions that are addressed in the Summa Theologiae. And if that already sounds overwhelming, you need to understand that each question is subdivided into a series of articles, or we would just say sub-questions. So, for instance, we're reading question 112 from the first part of the second part. And the first question is about the cause of grace. And you'll see in your reading that it is divided further into 5 articles. Now, that's actually a relatively small number of articles. Sometimes the articles there could be 10 of them, there could be even more. So think about that. When I say there's 600 questions in the Summa Theologiae, just keep in mind that each one of those questions is then further sort of ramified into 4 or more articles. Okay, so this is really kind of, this is a lifetime's work to really master the Summa Theologiae. Now, I need to say one last thing about reading these, because you have not read anything in your life like this before. So let me briefly orient you. So for every article, you're going to have a question at the very beginning. In this case, it's up here in bold. Is God alone a cause of grace? Okay, that's the question to be decided. Then you're going to see a series of objections. Now, these are not objections to the question itself, right? These are not like, oh, you shouldn't even ask that question. No, these are objections. These are answers to the question that Aquinas will eventually refute, okay? So the first objection here says, John 1:17 says, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. But in the name Jesus Christ, one understands not just the divine nature that assumes, but also the created nature that is assumed. Therefore, some creature is able to be the cause of grace. Now, the fact that we see that in an objection, that already tips us off to Thomas's own answer. If someone in one of the objections is saying that no, God alone is not a cause of grace, creatures can be a cause of grace too, you actually already know what his answer is going to be, which is affirmative. Yes, God alone is the cause of grace. But there's several of these here. There's 3 in this particular one. Again, there can be any range, any number of those. So you get objections, and usually the objector is going to cite some kind of authority. It could be scripture. It could be, well, as you see in objection 3, our good friend Dennis the Areopagite. Then you get the sed contra. Now that's a Latin phrase. It's typically translated in English, but contrary to this, or but rather. And then you get a very brief statement that sort of suggests that Thomas is not going to accept the arguments in these objections. And then you get to the most important part, although let me emphasize, you need to read all of this. But the most important part is the responsio, the I respond or I answer that. And here, it's just one paragraph, but it is, in a nutshell, Thomas's own answer to the question, is God alone a cause of grace? And you'll notice it's not just an answer. He doesn't just say yes, right? He also gives you a sense of why he's answering yes. And then he goes on to reply to each objection individually and explain why those objections to his answer are not fatal to his position, why those objections do not carry the weight that one might think. Now, that's not to say that these objections are frivolous or straw men kind of arguments. No, for Thomas, they're worth taking seriously, and that's why he takes the time to deal with them. But just because they're worth taking seriously doesn't mean that they are right. And so he's trying to explain why the objections just don't hold water. So you're going to be reading 5 of these 5 articles. They all have exactly that same format, although the numbers of objections and things like that may fluctuate. So it's really, it's just that initial acclimating that's difficult. Once you kind of figure out what's going on here with the format itself will no longer really bother you, I don't think. But this is one of those readings you just have to proceed very slowly because it's very dense. There's some technical terminology and things like that. So let me know if you're really struggling with just sort of how to read Thomas. It's short, okay? I mean, just a couple of pages. So just slow down. Prepare to read certain things. Perhaps prepare to read entire articles a couple of times if need be. All right, we'll check in on Thomas Aquinas again next week.